want to thank all of you for making it here this morning. My name is Rachel Stohl. I'm the Managing Director here at the Stimson Center, and I run our conventional defense program. And as many of you know, every year my program is lucky enough to serve as the host for the launch of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or better known as SIPRI, release of their data on the trends and in both the international arms transfer realm, but also in global military expenditure. And if you don't know SIPRI, which you will learn a lot about SIPRI today, they're widely regarded as one of, if not the most authoritative public resources on the international arms trade. And for those of us in this field, we get a little giddy on days like today when we get all the new data. So it's very, very exciting. And I think, you know, this week, our focus, well, I think any week in Washington, our focus is a little bit all over the place. And this week, I think we've been very focused on the withdrawal of the Iran deal, or from the Iran deal by the United States, and really on sort of what that might mean for the spread or potential spread of weapons of mass destruction more globally. And certainly that is an important issue, and those are important questions. But we think, when we think about the instability that could result from the withdrawal from the Iran deal, we think about the conflicts that could result from that. Those will likely be conventional ones, fought very much with the weapons that we're going to be talking about today, and spent with the money that we're going to be talking about today. So this is a very timely, you didn't know you were coming to an event that was timely and relevant to the Iran deal, but it is, even though it's on the conventional arms trade. The other sort of framing note that I would like to make is that in the last couple of weeks, we've seen more evidence than ever before that this administration is using arms sales to address its foreign policy and security, national security, but using the argument of economic security. And that is, I think, very relevant to our discussion today in terms of how do we think about the arms trade in terms of promoting our national interest, but is it actually good for our economy? Is it good for jobs? And does it have any sort of positive net benefit to our security interests? And so I want to sort of, as we're hearing from Pieter about the trends that we're going to be talking about, are these, what will these trends do to the approach of the Trump administration, or what kind of implications will they have? So for this event today, we're really fortunate to have an expert panel to talk about not only the trends and the data that SIPRI will present, but also the implications for the United States. And we will have time for Q&A, I promise. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative, though, and ask a lot of questions to sort of get the conversation going. But just to introduce our panelists, and I believe the bio sheets are on the sides of the room if you don't have one. But we're very pleased to host Pieter Wezeman from SIPRI, Valerie Insinna from Defense News, and Kate Kaiser from Win Without War, and we really look forward to sort of a bunch of different perspectives that perhaps you're used to in Washington to talk about these issues. I think we'll start with Pieter to talk us through some of the data, and then we'll move to Kate and Valerie. So welcome, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting us here and having us here and doing this every year, giving SIPRI the opportunity to present our data and having a discussion about, well, the role of the US, but also of others in the world of military spending and arms transfers. SIPRI collects this data with the objective of better arms control in the world. And what we do then is we collect this information, as has been said, about military spending and about major arms. And yes, you mentioned this week is very much a discussion about the US withdrawal from the Iran deal, which is partly about nuclear arms. But sadly enough, in a way, President Trump also used SIPRI data, apparently, or it seems as if he used that. I'm not sure about it really, but he seems to indicate that Iran has increased its military spending a lot over the previous years. And I'd like to put that into perspective. So what I will do now is to present you the global trends and patterns, and then focus a little bit on the Middle East as far as the little time I have allows me. So I'm going really fast here, so bear with me, and hopefully I don't go too fast on this little roller coaster. And the roller coaster starts here with the data on military expenditure over the past 30, 40 years. We see a very clear development here, a steady increase after a drop after the Cold War, a steady increase from about 2002 to a stable level at about 2010 to 2017, a stable level, at a high level at 1.7 trillion dollars a year. Trillions and billions are very difficult for a European to understand. It's really confusing there. But trillions here. And of course, when we look at this, it seems very stable, but there are great variations when we look at actual countries or regions. And that we can see here in the first place. The biggest military spender in the world is, of course, and you won't be surprised about that, the United States, accounting for 35% of world military spending, followed at some distance by China, and then at a further distance by countries like Saudi Arabia, India, and Russia. And then a number of countries in Europe, France, the UK, Germany are important ones to mention there. Maybe also important to mention here, which you don't see on the graph itself, is the fact that if you take the whole NATO alliance together, the NATO accounts for 52% of global military spending, more than half going to one military alliance. Let's have a little bit of a closer look at the details in this trend. And we see here on the top part of the bar is the development in the US, probably very familiar to you, where we see that the US has seen a decrease in military spending from about peak in 2009 to a kind of steady level in 2016 and 17, of course, to be followed by an increase in 2018 and maybe beyond if President Trump gets what he wants to have. We can also have a look here at China. That's the second part of the bar, that's the white bit. China has seen a steady increase in military spending over the past 29 years, roughly an increase of 5% a year following its economic growth. And that, for example, leads to, in the past 10 years, a doubling of its military spending. So there we see a very significant development. Let's have a look at the next number of countries there. And we can have a look, for example, at Russia, an important military spender in the world. We also see there a continuous increase since 1998 up until the peak in 2016. But a very important development there is that then it comes to an end. We see a sudden decrease of 20% from 2016 to 2017. Economic conditions in Russia simply don't allow the continuing rise in military spending in the region. We see also some examples here from Europe. France and Germany have started to increase their military spending in recent years, and we see that reflected here into a relatively modest increase over the past few years. Let's have a look at the regional trend here then. And the regional trend, as I mentioned before, I think for the world, it has been a very small increase, 2016, 2017. Basically, it has been stable. But what stands out here is the very large increase in Central Europe, a direct reaction to the threat perceptions that have grown in Central Europe towards Russia, related, of course, to its annexations of part of Ukraine and also to its development of its military capability. Even though, again, and that we see in the bar which indicates the decrease for Eastern Europe, Russian spending decreased a lot in 2017. Now, that was military spending. The last graph I want to show here, or the last picture I want to show here, is military spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. The military burden. And we see that the variation is very big. We see that in the Middle East, the military burden is very high. A country like Saudi Arabia spends an estimated 10% of its GDP on military spending. Russia is also in red, also a high military spending. Then you have the countries in dark green. And of course, the US stands out there with military spending as a percentage of GDP of about 3.1%. And then we have the lighter green ones in Europe and also China, which have a military spending of somewhere around 1.5 to 2% of their GDP. And that compares to a global level of about an average of 2.2% of GDP. Now, for all those who make notes, I forgot to say that, of course, the data is all available on the internet and all that, and they also brought publications, short fact sheets, where all this information is summed up in further detail.
Could I ask you just a quick question? When you're talking about military spending, is it total spending, including on personnel as well as equipment?
Yes, it is all spending related to military activity. Personnel, pension, equipment, operational costs, etc. Yes. Okay, I just race on because time is limited here. But we go to the next roller coaster here, and that's the trends and international trends of major arms. Now here it gets a bit difficult when it comes to the methodology behind this. I will take some questions about that later if you want to, but right now I'm just going to say that what we do is we look at major arms, deliveries of major arms, we look at how many are being transferred every year, we give a value to each type of weapon, and we multiply that with the number which we have identified as being transferred, imported, or exported during a certain year. And that then results into something which we call a trend indicator value. So again, if you want to know more, please ask later, and I can explain in detail. What we see here is quite some strong fluctuations year on year, and that's why we rather speak about 5-year moving averages. And there's a thin line there which shows what the trend is in 5-year moving averages. And that line shows very clearly an increase, a steady increase in international arms transfers over the period starting in about 2004 to 2017. If we compare 2013 to 17, 5 years, with the previous 5 years, 2008 to 12, we can see that a 10% increase in arms transfers if we compare those two periods of 5 years. Let's look shortly at the largest arms exporters in the world. If we look at this, the top 5 arms exporters in the world, USA, Russia, France, Germany, and China, account for a total of 74% in our estimates, of course, of the world's arms transfers during the past 5 years. Let's go a little bit more into detail here, and let's start with the USA. It accounts for 34%, so it's by far the largest arms exporter in the world. It has seen a 25% increase in arms exports according to our estimates, comparing the two previous 5-year periods here. And we therefore see that the gap is widening between the United States and the other arms exporters. Also important here is to mention that not only in absolute terms the arms exports by the US are very, very large, but also the number of countries that do get weapons from the US is very large. We have identified 98 countries in the period 2013 to 17 that have received major arms, and of course there are other types of military goods which could be included too, and then the picture would even be more dark purple than it is already now. If we compare that then to the other arms exporters in the world, we can talk a bit about Russia, the second largest arms exporter in the world. It's very different there. First, of course, we see a decrease in arms exports over the past 5 years. And secondly, we also see that Russia exports to much fewer states in the world. We have identified 47 states that have imported Russian major arms in the past 5 years. And we also see that Russia's arms exports primarily go to a very small group of countries, the top 3, which account for 58% of Russian arms exports. India alone accounts for 35%. Other observation here, a quick one, is that China has seen a very significant increase in its arms exports over the past decade or so, very much related, of course, to the fact that Chinese military products are increasingly competitive on the international market. They just make better stuff than they used to do before. Shortly then, a nice pie here, which again highlights the fact that 90% of the arms exports in the world are accounted for by 10 major arms suppliers. And maybe a short word about that others. There are a number of countries which in the future may actually also end up in this top 10, pushing out, for example, The Netherlands there, which is, of course, in my view, very bad because I am Dutch, and of course the Netherlands should also be in the top 10 there. But no, a country like South Korea has developed its arms industry and has become rather successful in recent years in signing deals for arms deliveries, and it's likely that in the coming years they may also end up in the top 10 there. Which then brings us to the arms import side. Now, the largest arms importers are mentioned here. 9 of the 10 largest arms importers are in Asia or the Middle East and North Africa. The only exception being Australia there. Let's have a few quick observations about the details in the top 10 arms importers here. We see that India is the largest arms importer, has grown its arms imports with 24%. Very interesting there is the fact that Israel and the US are now significant arms suppliers to India. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, and that wasn't even the case for the US 10 years ago. That's a major development there. Other observation to be made here, China has seen a steep decrease in its arms imports. Again, also very much related to the fact that they now can cater for their own military equipment much more than they could do before. Quickly then about the regional changes. The total arms transfers in the world have increased, but that increase is mainly due to the very large increase in the Middle East. There it has almost doubled. In other parts of the world it has either gone down, Europe, Africa, the Americas, or it has basically stayed stable, as in the case of Asia. Now, the Middle East then, that's the focus which I promised I would spend a few words on too. And it's nicely exemplified by this first picture showing the military expenditure in the region. 3 quick observations here. The first one being that for some countries there's no proper data available for 2017. UAE and Qatar are very important to mention there, and I'll explain later why. Secondly, the military burden in the region is very high. I mentioned that already before, but again, Saudi Arabia, 10% of GDP goes to military spending. Oman, even more. Countries like Kuwait, Qatar. 7 out of the 10 countries with the largest military burden in the world are actually in the Middle East. And finally, very clearly and important, also in the light of the discussion about the Iran deal, is the big asymmetry we see between Saudi Arabia and, of course, Iran. Saudi Arabia spends roughly 5 times more than Iran does, according to the data which we have been able to dig up. And then we don't even take into account what the UAE spends. And that's kind of shown here in this graph. We see the development over time, a very steep increase in Saudi military spending since about 2005, and of course that massive drop in 2016 due to the low oil prices and therefore the low or the very diminished revenues in government income for Saudi Arabia. But still in 2017 a slight recovery there again, so we'll see where that goes in the coming years. Then the UAE, that's the kind of purplish line. Stops in 2014, last year, for which we had some data on which we were willing to base an estimate. About $24 billion in that year, and we can assume that it has remained kind of stable at least in the years after, due to the large procurement, arms procurement programs that are ongoing in the UAE, and of course also its involvement in several major conflicts in the region. Yemen, Syria, Libya, to name the most important ones. And then we have Iran, and there's that story again. Yes, Iran has increased its military spending since the end of some of the major economic sanctions by the EU, by the UN. We see that it increases from 2013 to 2017. Significant increase, but it's not even yet reached the level of 2006 when it had a peak. And of course, after 2006, a steady decline until 2013. So that whole story about this increase of military spending in Iran should be put in this kind of perspective. Arms imports, well, we see a similar picture here, although it might even be more extreme. Here we have actually data for the UAE and Qatar, and that shows that they are very significant arms procuring countries, and therefore we must assume that they also have very significant military spending. UAE has been an arms importer for a long time on a high level. Qatar has only started to do so in recent year. And the circle we see here is still relatively small, but we can expect it to grow significantly in coming years. Yes, please.
Sorry, excuse me. Could you please clarify the difference between those slides then? So this is imports and the other one
Was spending.
was spending. Okay, got
Spending.
it. Got it.
And spending is about all military spending. Let's repeat that again. And this is just about procurement of arms. And procurement of arms in the region is particularly relevant to look at because none of the states in the region has a fully developed arms industry. I would even say that most of the arms industries are still relatively rudimentary. All countries are very dependent on arms imports. Arms imports roughly equals arms procurement in the region. Asymmetry is here again very clear. Saudi Arabia is a very big arms procuring country, the UAE too, Egypt for example too, Qatar is growing into one. These states have still access to arms. There are still many countries most countries I would say, which are willing to supply them with arms. In the case of Iran, that's not the case. They remain under UN sanctions or UN restrictions, I should say, on arms exports to Iran, which will only be lifted in 2020. So not much development there for now. Now, here's the thing which is not a graph. As you can see, it's just a few pictures. But I put that in just to show one of the things we do at SIPRI is, of course, collect information of all the types of arms being exported to countries. And it's important to stress that in the Middle East, the countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have heavily invested in arms which have increased their military reach. They are more able to do out-of-area operations. You see that the UAE is active in Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen, that Saudi Arabia is active in Syria, is active in Yemen too, and that's made possible by the type of equipment which they have received, particularly also in the last 10 years. Anything from combat aircraft to cruise missiles to airborne early warning systems to tanker aircraft, and of course also the means to protect themselves against missile attacks by others in the form of missile defense systems from the United States. Very quickly, because time is running out here, who are the main exporters to the Middle East? Well, let's just look at the Gulf region only for now. It is very clear that the US is by far the most important supplier of weapons to the Arab states in the region, followed in general by several major European states. In the case of Iran, it's primarily Russia, followed at quite a distance by China for at least now. Now, final remark to be made here. Of course, we really want to understand militarization and armament developments in the region. There's so many other things we would like to look at. The aircraft carrier symbolizes the external involvement, how countries like, in particular, the US, but also others, are very active in the region. And of course, we should take that into account in any assessment too. But of course, also the arms transfers between countries in the region, the supply of weapons to proxy forces or state allies. And of course, that is something which we can also discuss if you have any further questions about it. But to finish this off, I think the picture we see for the Middle East is that most countries in the region not only acquire arms, they actually use arms. Most countries in the region, except for one, have been using their military equipment in combat in the past 5 years. Only Oman has not, as far as I can see. So I think in the light of that, in the light of the competition for regional leadership in the region, in the light of the fact that countries put so much emphasis on military capability as their kind of a key tool for both defense, for regime survival, and also for competition for regional leadership, the increase in military spending and increase in arms procurement should really raise the question what the risk is that those countries are going to use those weapons which they have acquired, the military capacity which they have built up, at least on paper, the risk that they're going to use that even more than they already do.
Wow. Thank you, Pieter. I mean, I know I only gave you 15 minutes, and you did an amazing job to summarize really what I think every year sort of surprises me in terms of very clear winners and losers, I guess, is the way, to think about it in this administration, in terms of the arms trade, in terms of the U.S. really being unrivaled in not only the number of weapons it sells and the amount of money that it spends on its military, but also how it dominates sort of the world map. It's sort of, with very few exceptions, Iran being sort of blatantly obvious here, the U.S. sort of has its fingers in the arms pots of all of these different countries, and it makes me. And so I have a lot of questions for you, but
Great.
I'm going to move on for just a moment because it makes me think about what we've heard from this administration in the last 2 weeks, that we have this new conventional arms transfer policy, which we could do a whole other event on. But we have this new conventional arms transfer policy, which at its very core is about the need to sell more and sell it more easily to more and more countries. And seeing this data, I'm struck by the fact of, okay, we are already selling more than not only everybody else, but than ever before. We are selling to more countries than ever before, with greater influence in those markets than ever before. And the markets that are not open to us, the Irans, for example, are not going to be open to us in the near future. So I guess my first question to Valerie, to sort of put you on the spot, is sort of as you're out there talking to both defense companies and the administration and hearing sort of the messaging about U.S. arms sales, how are we sort of squaring the circle of we need to sell more when we're already selling more than we did before, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess first off, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor to sit among all of these distinguished panelists. So I think there are a couple things to note here. I think that industry is always going to be insatiable. They are always going to want to sell more to, various partner nations around the world, and no matter what, they're always going to be promoting that they've got to return, profit to their shareholders. It's all about the money, I think what's interesting is over the past year, we've really started to see Trump making arms sales a major focal point of his presidency. When he gives speeches, speaking with world leaders, he often will mention, and we're selling them this weapon. A couple weeks ago, when the leader of Nigeria was here, he stood up and was, talking about selling, he said it wrong, but A-29 Super Tucanos to Nigeria.
Helicopters. Are
Yes,
those helicopters?
and also
No,
helicopters,
they're not
which we do
they're
not.
not helicopters.
Yes. So I think, it's really interesting to see the Trump administration. You can see that they obviously view arms sales as a way to demonstrate America's military might and its financial might. And so I think, I think it's sort of a branding move by Trump to be able to say, look at how much weapons that we're selling in the world, and we're going to sell even more. It goes back to his Buy American philosophy. But as this data shows, we've always been the top seller of arms, and Democrat administration, Republican administration, that's probably going to be the case as well.
Absolutely, and I think what's interesting, given what's in the news this week, and, it's in the news many weeks, but what's particularly relevant in the news this week, and the data that Pieter just demonstrated, I think the Middle East is very much a focus. And if we think about sort of stories that appear in your publications or other defense publications in this town, usually the Middle East is sort of, what are we selling to the Middle East? What does the Middle East want? And we'll get to Kate in terms of what should the Middle East have or not have. But how does the Middle East, sort of the politics of that, sort of play in when you're traveling with defense officials or visiting particular locations? Is sort of the Middle East at the front of everyone's mind in terms of arms sales as well? Or is it just, that's sort of the end result?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I traveling, around with the Air Force, working a lot with the Air Force, you kind of see that this idea of selling arms to the Middle East, it's not just coming from Trump. it's, within the services themselves, they see it as a way of being able to have greater connectivity with partners. Like, for example, the light attack aircraft program that the Air Force is thinking of doing. They, when leaders talk about this, it's not just, oh, maybe we're gonna buy some light attack aircraft for, ourselves to use in the Middle East, but it's also, and we're going to get allies and partner nations on board, and maybe X country in North Africa or the Middle East can't afford an F-16, but they can buy this, and then we can, fight together and work together. So I think, arms exports in the Middle East is actually becoming a larger part of the services conversation that they, have externally to the public.
Is it generally more sort of this interoperability argument that you're hearing, or is it very much a sort of there are new threats and we have to respond in more flexible, more rapid ways? Is that, where's sort of the line falling, do you think?
I think it's both. I think there's a lot of talk about connectivity with allies, but of course, always talk about threats and how do we deal with them, and how do we make sure that our allies and partners are equipped to deal with those threats on their own, or as we work as a coalition. So I think it's sort of both things.
You mentioned, it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democratic administration. I think the data that Pieter showed, it's pretty much an upward trajectory regardless of who is in office. But have you noticed, particularly in the last year and a half, when you're interacting with partners, with allies, with defense companies, has there been a change in tone or shift in actual results? Is there a change, or is it sort of just continuing the status quo of how things are moving in an upward trajectory?
I think that there has been a change in tone, because I think President Trump has, put out there as a message, we want to sell American goods, around the world, and those goods include weapons. And I think it's also changed on the human rights standpoint, because I just think, I think the F-16 sale to Bahrain, I think, the A-29 sale to Nigeria, some of those type of sales show, that human rights is just not as big of a concern to this administration as it has been in previous administrations. You can debate whether that's a good thing or not, or the balance to strike there, but I think that's just the fact.
So you did hear in say the Obama administration, you would hear conversations about, well, we're concerned about the human rights in this particular country, and now is it just not talked about, or is it we're just going to pretend that's not happening?
Oh, I think it's. I'm not sure if we hear a lot of public commentary about that, but I think. And Kate, you've been nodding. I think the fact that we saw the F-16 deal to Bahrain kind of be put on hold by the Obama administration as they evaluated, the human rights situation there, and then Trump becomes president, and then the deal becomes okay. I think that sort of shows that there's just a different standard happening.
Sure. I'm not going to hold you to this, but given that we're talking about trends, if you could sort of prognosticate what you see coming forward in the next year. If we were to sit here again a year from now and Pieter's presenting his charts and data, what, from your perspective and what you're seeing sort of out in the field? You're out in these places, covering these stories, talking to those, making the weapons, engaging in the deals, talking to the administration officials who are promoting them. What would you see? Maybe it's just more of the same, but what do you see as sort of the trends that we should be looking forward in the next year or so?
So I think one of the big major outlying questions for me is, now that we're seeing some reform to drone exports, are we going to see an upswing in drone sales, especially to the Middle East? And if, something, God forbid, horrible happens, these weapons are misused, how does the administration deal with that? How do these companies deal with that bad press? I think that's going to be something to watch. Also, connected to that is whether the U.S. pursues or continues to pursue changes to the missile technology control regime.
So you mentioned companies. If we had an industry representative here, what would you guess that they would be sort of looking at this map? Would they see it differently than maybe the four of us sitting on this stage or those in the audience? Like, is there something in here, like, do you see a market opportunity? Is there a sort of untapped potential here? I see Joel Johnson shaking his head no, but, is this a good news story, do you think, from your perspective, what you're writing about? Is this a good news story for the United States defense industry, or is this where else can we sell, the market's tapped out?
I mean, I think it's a good news story for industry in the fact that they can expect sales to continue, but I think there's no surprises here. I think industry has done their homework and they know that, there are no unknowns here. I think that for U.S. drone manufacturers, the market may be more wide open now than it ever has been.
So I want to turn to Kate, because you said it's a good news story for industry. I'm not sure it's a good news story for those sort of concerned about human rights issues. And Valerie sort of hinted about how human rights have seemingly taken a back burner to the desire to sell more, and whether it's the resumption of sales that had been put on hold or increased sales of, say, precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia, which are questionable because of their use in Yemen to target civilians, whether we can get into a discussion if it's intentional or not. There certainly does seem to be sort of a bad news story from a human rights perspective, and what we're seeing sort of as the larger importers on these graphs. So I want to start there. It wasn't where I was going to start. I know that's not what I told you I was going to start, but I want to start there because I think it's an interesting segue into what we do about it. Can you talk a little bit about sort of why this is not a great news story for particularly countries in the Middle East?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as we've seen the president's move to really make his foreign policy about arms sales in a way that we build relationships by selling weapons. And if a country is buying our weapons, that means they're our critical ally. We saw this in the Crown Prince's visit of Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, where Trump was holding up a chart saying, look at all these places they're buying weapons from us, even though that chart was not necessarily accurate. And as part of that process, and as part of kind of this transactional, securitized foreign policy that this administration has really put forth, we've largely seen human rights considerations and the misuse of these weapons go by the wayside. The Obama administration was also quite quick to make sales to Middle Eastern countries, and especially in the wake of the Iran deal, to the Gulf in particular. But at the same time, there is still at least some concern about human rights, about the use of the weapons, what was going on domestically, whether selling these weapons would actually, these countries would then follow the laws on the U.S. books about exporting weapons and gross human rights violations. But under the Trump administration, we've really seen this kind of just go all away. There's really no discussion of human rights. There's no in terms of kind of the export license review, particularly with Saudi Arabia, Secretary Tillerson, one of his first moves in office was to say that selling precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia was fine, regardless of what was happening in Yemen. And in the meantime, these weapons, there's continued to be a systematic pattern of misuse of these weapons and targeting civilians and civilian objects in the war in Yemen. And each time that happens, the administration, largely ignores it. Maybe it's a mistake. The coalition that's operating in Yemen will sometimes announce an investigation or say they're, looking out for human rights. And I think this administration takes them at their word, and there's not really a deep assessment as to what is going on with their use. And it's really unfortunate, I think, as well, because it empowers these countries to use these weapons in ways that they are not meant to be used. That have second-order effects, not only for the countries using the weapons, but also for the United States and other countries that are selling these weapons that are then involved in potential war crimes. And then what does accountability look like there? And obviously under this administration, there's very little talk of accountability, but one day I think there will be, and I think our arms sale policy really is loath not to consider these long-term implications of the use of these weapons.
So under this new conventional arms transfer policy, for those who have not read it very specifically, There is sort of in some ways, there is sort of a narrowing of the human rights conditions. In other ways, you could argue that there is a strengthening in that it recognizes civilian harm. It says, we have to mitigate the risk of civilian harm. It does include sort of human rights issues going forward. It doesn't seem to have any sort of past look at what was happening in the past, but trying to say we want to protect human rights moving forward. Do you think that this new policy will sort of undermine any efforts at the administration level, before we talk about Congress, at the administration level to do these more in-depth reviews? There's sort of they've added the word intentional targeting of civilians rather than just the targeting of civilians or attacks against civilians. So there's sort of this awareness that sometimes mistakes, or I have heard the administration use the word incompetence over the use of U.S. weapons and the need to sell more so that we can provide more training to make sure that targeting is improved. But do you see that as sort of as an issue?
I mean, I think, that language is nice window dressing, but by saying, it's about the intentional use against civilians, that even raises the bar further. And when the DoD looks at intentionality in the use of weapons or other U.S. security assistance, they look at it from a court of law perspective, that you have to have, motive and all of these other factors to prove the intentionality. Otherwise, it's not intentional. It's incompetence or a mistake or all of these other different factors. And so, and the other thing about it is by preventing the institution from looking backwards at the track record and at the pattern of misuse by some countries of these weapons, you're missing the bigger picture here. And past performance is the best indicator of how these weapons will be used. And in a situation like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Yemen, there has been over 3 years of evidence of misuse, whether or not it's intentional or incompetence. The pattern remains the same and has really only intensified since this administration came into office. So unfortunately, those factors coupled with like a lack of institutional will, I think, at the State Department, because we have a new Secretary of State who very much believes in this securitization of foreign policy, I am very worried that it's not going to get the attention that it needs.
And we've seen sort of this shift from the administration sort of taking ownership of this human rights conditionality. And we've seen this shift to Congress, which is, as someone who's done this for 20 years in this town, I mean, it is rather remarkable that we have congressional debate and conversation about arms sales. It is very challenging, for those who are not familiar with the process, for Congress to actually stop an arms sale. I believe the last time was 1989, if that's correct, to Saudi Arabia, in fact. So it is very challenging for Congress to move through their process to stop an arms sale. But we've seen in the last few years, we've seen Congress take a very active role in debating, particularly with regards to arms sales to the Middle East, debating the U.S. role and complicity in a war being perpetuated with U.S. weapons. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what we're seeing in Congress and why this is happening now more than ever before? Because it started before, I should say, it started before the Trump administration came into office. We did have congressional action in the Obama administration as well, but it is a new trend for sure.
Absolutely, and as you said, I think this has been growing over time, and there's kind of more and more momentum around having these debates because it's becoming more socialized in Congress that, well, we passed these laws, it's our job to enforce these laws, and so now looking at how they can actually do their job in a way to ensure that the administration's policies is actually is in line with U.S. legality issues, especially in the transfer of these weapons. So, under the Obama administration, we started seeing resolutions of disapproval introduced about arms sales to Bahrain, to Saudi Arabia, largely due to either the domestic political situation and human rights crackdowns by these governments, or due to foreign military interventions abroad that were causing mass civilian harm, as in Yemen. And unfortunately, under both administrations, these arms sales to these actors has only really increased, and I think that's why you've started to see Congress really start to take notice of like, well, we keep saying things, but they aren't changing anything, so maybe we need to take action. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the second part of it, though, is really this Trump factor, this idea that we no longer have to be a beacon of human rights. It doesn't have, we're not, doing foreign policy to spread our values in any way. It's really about making deals and transactions, and that's how we build relationships around the world. And I think Congress is quite uncomfortable with that. There's a lack of attention to diplomacy, to resolving conflicts peacefully and politically, even though that's the stated goal of this administration in many conflicts around the world. It's really only lip service. There's no actual diplomatic action or steps being taken to resolve these conflicts peacefully. And I think the final factor with all of this is that, I think there is a recognition that it's kind of gotten out of hand. That there was such a previous lack of oversight, a lack of oversight of the DoD, of these arms transfers, as well as just the ceding of congressional powers over what power it has over foreign policy, particularly with regard to war making, because I do think that kind of this cycle of endless war that we're in over the last 17 years contributes to our arms exports abroad, because as Valerie was saying, we want partners that can work with us and do these missions jointly and have interoperability, and so that only increases our exports around the world. And I think Congress is just really starting to call the question, but in particular, we've seen the most momentum, I think, around the selling of arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE purely due to their conduct in Yemen. And the continued pattern of potential war crimes in the country committed using U.S.-sold weapons. I mean, as little as like 2 weeks ago, there was documented use of a U.S.-sold precision-guided munition in Yemen on a wedding, which was the fourth wedding that the coalition struck since the beginning of the intervention in March 2015. And so this, this pattern of civilian harm using U.S. weapons is not going away. It's also contributing to the radicalization of an anti-American sentiment abroad. And if the administration is really concerned about national security, is really concerned about stemming the flow of terror groups around the world, it needs to be thinking about how these other policies, like the unconditional transfer of arms to countries like Saudi Arabia that are misusing the weapons in these ways, really have an impact on that counterterror strategy. Because essentially it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're just making the problem worse, so then you have to sell more and do more, and then it makes the problem worse again. And then we're kind of back at square one. And I think Congress is starting to wake up that there's real questions about the way we're conducting wars abroad. What are we actually doing? Are we making the situation better? And are our partners actually conducting themselves in a way that are productive to our own interests?
So you mentioned that Congress hasn't been successful so far. I'm wondering, do you see any, and the votes, I mean, for those who follow, the votes are closer, are closer than they have been before. So 44, I think, was the last, 44 senators for the last sort of vote around disapproving a particular transfer. But do you think that because the momentum for this congressional disapproval and involvement is growing, do you think in the next 1, 2, 3 years we will see a Congress able to stop a particular arms sale, or do you think the struggle is it's moving forward but it's still a long ways to go?
I certainly think there's a long way to go. These blocking an arms sale is really unprecedented by both chambers, because then you also have to override a veto, and that takes a supermajority in each chamber. But as you said, in 2016 there was a fight around the tank sale to Saudi Arabia. That was kind of the first Senate fight on arms sales to Saudi. That got 27 senators. And then in June of last year, there was another fight about PGM kits that were previously put on hold by the Obama administration due to the misuse of U.S.-sold weapons in Yemen. That garnered 47 senators. So we had a 20 senator increase in just over a year. And then this latest vote, which was about ending all U.S. security assistance and military involvement in the war in Yemen, which is by invoking the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which is a pretty radical move, has never been tried actually in the Senate and has never had a vote like this. And 44 senators in a bipartisan fashion voted for that resolution to move forward with ending U.S. support for the war. So I think there's unprecedented opposition. And now, with the conglomeration of these votes, we've now seen a bipartisan majority in the Senate vote to block assistance to Saudi Arabia and the coalition in Yemen in some fashion. And so, there's a lot of talk about a large upcoming precision-guided munition sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because, they've largely used the stockpile that they have for Yemen. And I do think there is a clear path to blocking it, at least in the Senate. The House does not have the same rules that the Senate has. That allows them to have a privileged resolution on the floor. You have to do a lot more negotiations with leadership. But I do think even just the Senate passing a resolution like that, which is definitely a possibility, would send the political message that Congress has been wanting to send with these attempts in arms sales. I think there's recognition that even if you don't pass these resolutions of disapproval into law, that this is also about political signaling, not only to the administration, but our Gulf partners, that what they're continuing to do is not okay, it's not in the U.S. interest, and that U.S. support is not a blank check, at least per Congress, which in this Congress I think is wildly crazy, and I thought I'd never see it.
You know, I think it's really interesting because, you know, normally for an arms sale to get to the level of the formal notification, it's already had the informal conversations, or hey, we're going to sell this, just so you know, if it's going to raise any red flags, let us know. They don't like to have these very public displays of opposition. It just politically, you have, you know, 1 week you have the president holding up, here's the chart of all the arms sales we're selling to Saudi Arabia, and the next week you're having a fight in the Senate about future arms sales. It doesn't send a coherent message. And so I do think it is politically, this is a very interesting time to sort of be following these, and to put it in the context of the trends that Pieter talked about. It seems as though even despite that, we're seeing the Gulf region remain sort of the #1 destination for weapons, not only for the United States, but for other countries around the world. And it appears, if your trends sort of hold true for the next sort of 5-year chunk, that we're going to continue to see that uptick. And so all of these sort of points that we've raised in this initial discussion, I think will have more salience, you know, a year, 2 years from now, as we see not only these wars continue to cause, you know, incredible humanitarian crisis, but also just political instability in the region, as we see sort of the Trump administration operationalize their new approach to buy, you know, more American arms is a signal of sort of our strength and our power and of our economic security. And this, with Pompeo now in the State Department, the securitization of diplomacy, which I think had existed, and the State Department had ceded much of its diplomatic might in the last 8-10 years anyway. We're now seeing that sort of in spades. I think all of these conversations will continue to be extremely relevant. With that, I would love to open the floor for questions. We have about 25 minutes for that. We have mics. If you could just identify yourselves, and they will bring a mic to you. Sean, can you start here? Thank you.
Ken Meyer, Court TV producer. Quick aside, then a question. When you hear of Saudi Arabia bombing a wedding party or whatever, before you blame them, you might want to find out who provided the targeting data. I suspect in many cases it's us. Question, do you have, in the rankings of military expenditures by country, do you have that by purchasing power parity?
No, we don't do it by PPPs. The reason why we don't do is that when you would convert it to PPPs, you would use civilian, and you would. It would be based on a basket of civilian goods, as you could say. So PPPs, the values which you can use there are not designed to be used in the context of military activities, military procurement, etc. That's why we refrain from doing that. Of course, if you do it, you get a very different picture. Then, of course, Chinese military spending compared to US military spending would be much would likely approach military spending in the US in terms of PPPs much more. But again, we don't do that because we don't believe that the economic data which you would need to do this well is available.
How accurate do you think exchange rate scale is? Which is what you're using, right?
Yes.
Dollars to
also there, I mean, yes, of course, you're completely right when you're saying that all the figures we have are crude. They are ballpark figures. Ballpark because of the economic values we use to convert them, because also the information. If I say that Saudi Arabian military spending is 70 billion, that is based on what Saudi Arabia tells us and some analysis from our side. So yes, we have to take this with some carefulness, as is the case with any statistics, particularly any economic statistics. You're absolutely right if you want to make that point, yes.
We'll go here, thank you. And I'll come back.
Yes, thank you, Marisa Lino. Also for Mr. Wezeman, how do you deal with the issue in your formulas of major systems being built in multiple countries? Since, I mean, it is a globalized world, major systems, especially in Europe, could be built. Even in the United States, you have European companies that have established branches here in order to be able to participate. Thank you.
Excellent question. Yes, it's a major concern because the international production of arms is arguably growing. As I come from Sweden, I often give the example of the Swedish combat aircraft. Well, it isn't that Swedish in reality. It consists of an American engine, UK radar, sensors from Italy, and lots of other bits and pieces which will come from elsewhere. We deal with it to some extent that we take the major components. So for example, if we look at how the Swedish combat aircraft is being transferred or sold to, let's say, to Thailand, then we say, wait, we actually don't count the engine as Swedish, we count that as coming from the US. It's one way of trying to put some order in this. But of course, both the information we have and maybe even more important in this case, the resources that are available doesn't make it possible to create more detailed, disaggregated and accurate data than we do right now. And it doesn't seem that anyone else has managed to do that either, that anyone else has thought that. But these are very important points, and I think if we would delve deeper and if we would, for example, try to understand, another good example related to the Middle East is the European Eurofighter Typhoon combat aircraft, sold by the UK to Saudi Arabia. And in Germany, they rather not talk too much about this because in Germany, they're not very fond anymore of selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. But a certain percentage, maybe up to 30% of that combat aircraft actually is produced, has been developed and is produced in Germany. The components are then sent to the UK, they're assembled there, and the whole thing goes off to Saudi Arabia and then is being used to bomb targets in Yemen. Germany rather just kind of, they say, well, we got into that deal long ago, we stick to that, but it's not our fault, whatever. But it would be very useful if we could delve deeper and to show these kind of relationships too. Very good point, and I wish I could help you more in that regard.
I believe there are 6, if I'm not mistaken, there's 6 governments now, and that includes, I think, 2 parts of the Flemish government because they make their arms sales by region. That have, and I think they're all European, that have said they will no longer sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. I believe I think Germany's one, the Netherlands. I'd have to go back to my list, but there has been, so it'll be, and one of the sort of criticisms was it was very easy for those countries to make that commitment because of the deals that you just mentioned. So the deal had already been made. Well, we're certainly not going to go back on a deal, right? And you're not going to buy new Eurofighters every year. So it was sort of an easier deal to make to say, oh, well, going forward, we're not going to do it because we just made this very large sale in the past. That's a skeptic in me saying that perhaps these are made for more political reasons.
Still, I want to continue a bit on that one. I want to say that some countries have chosen to restrict, and I wouldn't necessarily say completely stop, but restrict arms sales to Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that they would have had, or their industries would have had a significant chance to sell major products to Saudi Arabia. The Netherlands has decided to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia and to a large extent also to the UAE. But it could have, if it really have wanted to, fought for a major deal for frigates or offshore patrol vessels, which in the end went to Spain. So there were opportunities there and they gave up on them. Same for Norway. They could have sold cruise missiles, which are now coming from the UK. So
So there has been some
I think
impact.
there are some which have made choices where they really, even though there were no big deals ongoing yet, but if they would have tried to, they would have had a major chance. So they have taken at least some responsibility there in that regard.
And I think what's interesting, and I know that's not what this panel's about, but the difference in sort of the public reaction in some of the European countries to sort of the public's almost sort of not even paying attention in this country to sort of what's happening. There's a much more active sort of public debate about arms sales to Saudi Arabia in those countries. There's a much more active civil society, non-governmental organizations, there are campaigns, there are lawsuits against particular, against the UK government, for example, for sales to Saudi Arabia. That was just, an appeal was just one, so that will continue to be tried. We don't really have that. I mean, we have obviously very dedicated experts and advocacy organizations in this country that are working this sort of at the very, at the grassroots, but also at the very policy wonk level, working with Congress, finding champions, et cetera. But you don't have sort of, U.S.-wide opposition to arms sales to Saudi Arabia, unless I'm mistaken. But you just don't see that kind of.
I think it's starting.
So stay tuned. But there is, I think, in Europe, at least talking to some of our European colleagues, there's a much more active, there are protests in the streets, there's a much more sort of parliamentary conversation. It'll be interesting to see if we have that. I have this woman here in pink, and then we'll move down to the side. We have Jeff and then Joel.
Hi, Lara Seligman with Aviation Week. I wanted to just press you a little bit on the issue of the F-35 and S-400 sales to Turkey. How far, I guess the question is, how far is the U.S. really willing to go to prevent Turkey from getting the S-400? I mean, we've seen Congress sort of try to block deliveries of the F-35, but nobody's actually blocking the sale. We've also seen trying to delay JDAM deliveries, kind of implicate other arms deals in this as well. But I guess what can the government actually do to prevent this from happening, and what are the pros and cons?
So Laura's not going to be able to use my commentary at all, but I mean, I actually was thinking about this during our conversation, when Kate was talking about Congress and them being willing to take more action, and also when Peter was talking about Eurofighter and how Germany is like, okay, well, maybe we can, sell more Eurofighters, or, we can, our components are in this aircraft and it's going to Saudi Arabia, and we'll just let that happen. And I think as the arms trade gets more globalized and as more partnerships occur on platforms like the F-35, it's going to be harder and harder to just not see sales going forward. So Turkey is a major industrial contributor to the F-35, and so and also a customer. So to not sell F-35s to Turkey, or to pull out all of the industrial participation that Turkey has, that would be a pretty huge thing for Congress to agree on, and I don't think it would happen, but I
agree. I think the paradox of the U.S. being the largest arms exporter, I think, is that there is a paranoia, particularly in Congress, about losing the market share in some way. Is if we don't sell these weapons to them, then China or Russia are going to move in and do it, and then we'll lose our ally, and the whole baby gets thrown out with the bathwater in this paranoia that goes around. And, that is a little bit overblown due to interoperability issues that were to occur if they, were to seek these types of systems elsewhere. But I do think that's an overriding concern of both the administration and Congress that, again, while there is concern about the trajectory that Turkey is on and what they were doing domestically, often gets overridden by these other more economic concerns.
I think the F-35 is the future of sort of the arms trade, in the sense of, its different component parts. It's using sort of in-country production to make something that not only is going to that country, but then also can be used in other countries. I mean, I think we're seeing that it's not just the Eurofighter example. I think it is sort of, we have a global supply chain. We have, whether you're sort of a mom and pop shop in the Midwest providing a tiny little component and having to deal with sort of ITAR issues in that sense, or if you are a major NATO partner in another country that's supplying a particular part. I think all of that is being integrated, and you're seeing a lot of these big defense companies are really systems integrators at this point. They're just taking all the different components from different companies and putting them together, which is hard when you talk about accountability, sort of where that lies. It's hard when you're talking about, if a country's saying we're not going to allow exports to a particular country, how do you, is it, if I have more than 10% of the component parts in that particular system, does that mean I have a right to say it doesn't go to a particular country? I think all of these issues are going to have to be struggled with more and more in the coming years than we have. And I think it's going to make Pieter's much, much harder to sort of figure out where are these things coming from, what's the expenditure look like. Hopefully not as much on the sort of who's selling what to whom in terms of the country of origin of that, who's making that deal, who's signing the contract. Maybe that will still be clear, but I think it will be more complex. I didn't mean to, if you wanted to answer, Laura, as well.
Yeah, I think the case of Turkey is a very interesting one, in which we see that Russia is trying very hard to get a part of the market in places where it hasn't succeeded that well before. It has succeeded in Egypt, it has succeeded in Iraq, now it moves on to Turkey. But has it really succeeded that much in Turkey? What do we talk about? We talk about 1-2 systems. Yes, that could be the beginning of something really big, but we talk about more than 100 F-35s. So it's a very big difference there. Now, of course, the US may choose to restrict this or hold this or slow this down, the sale of the or the actual delivery of the F-35s that are now being produced. But of course, you can also look at how the European states deal with this, and some of them don't really seem to bother about this at all. What they do is say, you know what, you buy the S-400, fine, but we have something else on offer. Actually, we have a better deal. Not only it's better technology, of course it is, but we also offer you cooperation. We're going to sell you the equipment, we're going to sell you the technology to build your own missile defense system based on the European Aster system. But the thing is that they integrate, and the question is really if the Russians can do the same thing. Look at how the Russians have succeeded in India. Well, they haven't really succeeded that well in India. That might be the fault of India, but the point is they haven't really shown that they're very good in transferring technology and helping other states to build up their arms industry. The European states are, and for that matter the US probably too. The examples which have been given, the F-35 itself, but also the F-16, which was had a similar kind of production or kind of international production system. And so I think I don't think it's going to change that much right now, this whole deal with the S-400s to Turkey. I have to see if it will develop into much more than that. Maybe more concerning for Turkey is the fact that Germany is now not willing to supply weapons to Turkey anymore. There the actual step has been taken to say, well, you wanted tanks or you wanted upgrades for tanks? No, we're not going to do that. You will have to look elsewhere, which of course the Turks then do, because there are other players on the market too. South Korea I mentioned as a new kid on the block, and they are very active in Turkey, and they were very willing to cooperate and to expand the production lines for example, their tanks. So we have to see how this develops, but I really doubt if we're going to see a very big change in the arms transfer relationship between the US and Turkey, just based on what that single deal. I think a little bit more has to happen. That's my quick assessment.
So do you think that the US is instead going to just, instead of restricting that 35 sale, maybe they'll rely on allies to try to pressure Turkey into not getting the S-400, or perhaps trying to give them a better deal on the Patriot missile?
I think in the end that they might have to do the latter thing to kind of to show, okay, you went for that one, fine, you have a few now. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, what was it? Greece did the same thing. They got the predecessor of the S-400. That was a bit of a complex deal, but in the end, as a NATO country, they turned to Russia too. Of course, Russia was more benign then at that time and all that. Sure, I know that, but still, they got over it. And
They're not buying the F-35.
no, they're buying just very much upgraded F-16s and lots of other stuff. And in the future, they may very well be a buyer of the F-35 too, or of any of the other advanced weapon systems that the US has, once they can afford it, which obviously they can't right now, or at least, well, actually they think they can afford stuff, so they do buy stuff, but that's a story in itself.
I love the arms trade humor. Let's come here with Jeff, and then we'll go over to Joel.
Hi, and thanks for this great panel. I have a lot of questions, so I will
yourself.
put them. Hi, I'm Jeff Abramson. I work with the Forum on the Arms Trade and also the Arms Control Association. I wanted to have a number of questions, but I'll put them under the idea of restraint and where in your respective worlds you ever hear the word restraint, and if they're, how's it used? I think, Valerie, for you, I don't know if restraint is the U.S. is restrained by competition or by U.S. law, and we need to remove that restraint. Kate, I think you're talking about restraint in human rights, but I think maybe there's other drivers that can be used. And then, Pieter, curious as to whether you see any restraint going on in the arms trade or military spending. And I also wanted to take advantage of you being here in terms of thinking about what's happening in Europe. And the Trump administration had been pressing NATO allies to increase their military spending. Whether you see that happening, and if you do you see that happening in investing in European capabilities, or which has been a lot of discussion about building it up themselves, or do you see that as driving more U.S. arms sales, and whether there's some factors going on there in terms of how Europe is supposed to be moving forward?
I'll go first. So I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you think about the defense industry and, them talking about their restraints. It's, always they're restrained by policy regarding foreign military sales or direct commercial sales of weapons. And you will always hear them complaining about the pace of sales. And I think for drone manufacturers, you hear about they are restrained or constrained under the MTCR over who they can sell to. Otherwise, I don't really think that, the topic gets a lot of conversation, especially as regards to the human rights portion. It's sort of something, don't talk about it, don't call attention to it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously I think Congress is moving a lot of times due to human rights constraints or wanting to put constraints because of human rights. I also think there is, a feeling within Congress that the president needs to be restrained in some way because he continues to take actions and make decisions without having a clear political strategy, whether it's the Iran deal or continuing U.S. participation in the war in Yemen, leaving troops in Syria indefinitely. There's no real, you can call it a plan B or just a plan for the day after, theoretically, especially with John Bolton on board, who is the master of let's just bomb them and then deal with it later. And so I do think that really kind of this war cabinet that's been built now in the White House is really starting to have Congress say, well, wait a second, like we used to have, oversight powers, or theoretically on paper in the Constitution we have oversight powers. We have the power over war making, but that's largely been flipped on its head. It started in the Obama administration under George W. Bush, but it's only been amplified under this administration. And so I do think that's why senators in particular are starting to talk about more and more restraints on the executive branch and how they can start clawing back some of the power that they've ceded over the years.
So as we're moving the mic over to Joel, I just want to say, because we don't have someone from the defense industry, I don't think the defense industry wants their weapons used to commit human rights abuses. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they don't have to be used at all, right? You can just buy lots of them and they can sit in a warehouse and nobody use them, right? Like, you're still buying them. It's a profit. It's a money situation. It's not we want to bomb people and kill them.
Well,
right?
they don't want the bad PR.
And they don't, I would say, and they certainly don't like opening the New York Times or Washington Post and seeing, a wedding party or a funeral procession, right? That is not sort of in their interest as sort of like human beings, but also from a profit PR perspective, that is not good for business. And so I do think, I don't want to leave the impression that we're saying, the defense industry doesn't really care about human rights. I think it's more that, they want, and, not to be their mouthpiece at all, but they want sort of, and the argument that you're hearing from the Trump administration with the release of this new policy is sort of, well, we want to have more efficiency in the system, and we want to have more predictability in the system, and not to waste time, going through huge rigorous reviews to major NATO allies. We just want to be able to sell them what they need in order to conduct the missions that we're jointly participating in to fight the war on terror. So I get that. I get it sounds really good. I think the devil is very much in the details here in terms of when you have efficiencies in the system, do you overlook Or do you remove the ability to have that restraint when that restraint becomes necessary? You can be a great partner and have a really bad policy with regards to sort of democratic opposition within your country or the human rights situation in your country. Doesn't mean you're not a really great partner, but we may have some difficulty. And I really liked what Kate said about sort of we're not interested in arms sales or in diplomacy as a way to promote our values and principles. I think that is very much what's missing from the new conventional arms transfer policy. That's absent. We used to use arms sales as a way to spread sort of the U.S. raison d'etre, right? It does not exist anymore, and it's definitely missing from the new conventional arms transfer policy. And so I think we'll see that sort of over the next few years evolve in perhaps ways that we didn't intend or expect.
If I could interject really
yes,
quickly,
sure.
yeah, I definitely didn't want to,
I didn't mean
imply
that you did.
that, the defense industry doesn't care about human rights, but I think, it's not their role. Like, they are not the political administration.
They're not making the
Congress.
decisions. Yeah.
So, like, they can't make the decision on how those weapons will be used or who they will be sold to. So, I mean, they're not going to raise the conversation of human rights or, these moral conversations. That's not really their role, and I think that's understandable.
Absolutely.
Well, and just
Yeah,
for one final point on that, I think it's also, part of the problem is it's the incentives on the inside. When state is reviewing these potential sales, they are incentivized, especially under this new policy, to make the sale. The incentive is not to find potential violations or misuse in the past, to then actually ask really deep questions about these future sales, and that, I think, is really part of the problem, is the incentives that are on the books.
So last question for Joel Johnson.
Well, a comment and a question, because you segued into one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is if you go back and look, I go back to the F-15 and AWACS sales to Saudi. For 10, 15 years, Congress looked at everything only in the prism of Israeli security. They didn't pay any attention to what we sold anywhere else. In a Cold War, we start arming both sides, and nobody fights anybody anymore. Good thing. Egypt, Israel, India, Pakistan, Greece, Turkey. Our weapons were best when they were never used. And that went on up through the good Bush's good Iraqi war, when Saudi pilots flew alongside our pilots. They shot some Iraqi planes down. And again, Congress then was pretty quiescent. So it's only really in the last 5-6 years that you've seen U.S. weapons, major weapons, used against targets and people in combat. We have 50 years of no history of that. So we have to get our heads around how to deal with it. Now, if you look at what we left of Iraq with our own heavy bombing, it's kind of hard to beat up on the Saudis. Best of intentions, bad targeting, bad results. But anyway, I mean, just to say, if you look at it in the perspective, this is a new thing for Congress to actually look at the use of U.S. weapons in ways that we've never happened before. The question I have for Pieter, and it gets back to an earlier one, we get thrown at us all the time that the U.S. spends more on defense than everybody else put together. And again, there ought to be some way of looking at what that is. I mean, a U.S. grunt, including VA benefits, pension, et cetera, probably is $100,000 to $300,000 a year. A Chinese grunt is probably $2,000, $3,000 max a year, probably not that much. And so when you look at their budget versus our budget, it's just completely uninformative of what they're getting for their money. Their military is 2 or 3 times larger in terms of ground forces than ours. And so it's frustrating, I think, for people that are in the defense world to see these numbers constantly thrown at us as if we're swimming in money. And if you look at the components of the U.S. defense industry or defense budget, it's a pretty small and shrinking percentage on hardware and on R&D. It's the first time it's going to go up in 10 years because of the push-up. And so you're really comparing apples and prunes. I mean, and we need, it seems to be somebody like SIPRI or somebody needs to find a way to have some kind of a better comparison as to what these military budgets mean, rather than just circles on the map. And anything you could elucidate on that would be helpful.
If only I could, if only I could. You're completely right. Of course, if you want to understand the relative military capability of states, we have to take in so many other considerations. And yes, a Chinese soldier will be so much cheaper. Is he also so much how much more effective is the US one? And if the US one is only twice as effective, would that be sufficient for the US to be anyway much stronger? These are such difficult questions to ask. And there is so much information which you would have to process to understand this, that there is no NGO in the world which is going to be able to do that in an appropriate way. Now then, of course, you ask the question, but why do you show this information in the first place? Well, I think it still is very useful to start up the kind of debate which we have today. Without that information, we wouldn't have anything to go on. We could sit here and we don't know anything about trends in the world, so let's go home. So yes, I agree, we would need to have so much more information, and we have to be careful with the type of information which we present here. But on the other hand, I think it does help us to understand the world better, and it does especially raise these questions. So that's where I can leave it for now, unless you can point me where I can get, the resources. You know that question. Yeah.
So I want to, given the time, I want to just give our panelists one last opportunity. If there's something you just needed to say, I don't want to leave you sort of hanging from this event. So yes, Pieter.
There was one question which I didn't answer yet, and that was the one about restraint. And I think that's a good one to end my part of the conversation here. Restraints in arms trade, yeah, we talk a lot about it, but the reality is that both the figures which we see, the increase in arms trade, and the continuing willingness of states to supply to arm other states is just there. And yes, we have some states in Europe which have then finally decided, after a lot of discussion and pressure, to restrict arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And the biggest one is Germany, and that's kind of a big deal. And the other ones are just a few small states, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway. I love them, but they are really small. So it doesn't make much of a difference there. So a lot of discussion in the UK, but in the end, no, we go ahead and we sell them another batch of Typhoons, because otherwise BAE Systems goes down the drain. Fine, we do that. And then on top of that comes that there are other states, well, of course, in the US, restraint seems to be thrown overboard to a large extent, although there's still restraint towards Venezuela and Iran and a few other rogue states, as we like to call them, or maybe not. But we also see that Japan is now looking to export arms. We see that Australia wants to be one of the big arms exporters in the world and really makes a big fuss about that. We see that South Korea is there. We see that China, of course, will try to get part of the pie and has succeeded in that. And in Russia, of course, too, there is a continuous flow of arms from there too. So I think restraint, alas, there's not much sign that we can really see real restraints in the future. We have an arms trade treaty. Well, it just means that you have an arms control system, that you have a way and kind of an organization that makes decisions. But usually the decisions tend to be in favor of arms sales anyway. At least that's my quick impression of the global arms trade right now.
Cool. No pressure.
So, thinking about the conversation that we just had, I think the main question, the lingering question that stands out to me is, with the Trump administration's new policies, their new direction on arms sales, is this about interoperability and capability with our allies, or is it about selling stuff? And I think an interesting case study that brings up even more questions possibly is looking at the failed sale of Super Hornets to Canada, because this was a situation where Boeing basically had a sale of Super Hornets in the bag, and then a trade disagreement with a Canadian commercial airliner pops up, and you really saw the Trump administration back Boeing as they were going through this. So I think maybe that raises a question of, is this just part of Trump's Buy American? Does Buy American trump building capability with allies? I think that's kind of the question that I have as I cover this, and that I continue to have, and we'll be watching for going forward.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say to add to that, I think, is, does Buy American trump our national interests in a lot of ways? I think we've seen, particularly with the Gulf and the Middle East, kind of an outsourcing of U.S. policy in these regions, purely based on this idea that we have to keep open this transactional relationship and do what they want in order for them to buy what we want to sell them. And that kind of flips these alliances on its head, and puts the U.S. largely in a position of weakness in these alliances. And I think that's really concerning, because the Gulf does not necessarily have the same interests that we have, whether regionally or globally. And I think Iran is a really great example that we had one of the strongest nuclear agreement in decades, and now we're not part of it, largely because our allies in the Middle East said we didn't want it, and we decided to trump global security with these alliances that are largely based on a transactional basis. So I think, unfortunately, we'll probably see that trend continue, but it's very worrying for kind of the bigger picture of U.S. foreign policy and global security.
Well, I think as evident from those last remarks, we could keep going. We could have many panels on this conversation, and luckily, we do have that opportunity. On May 20, sorry, I don't even know what month I'm in. May 22nd, we have a nearly all-day event, 12 to 5, here at the Stimson Center, at the first annual Forum on the Arms Trade Conference, where we will be looking at issues related to the impact of global arms sales, how do you mitigate risk with regards to arms sales, and how does an arms dealer actually do his business. We will start with a keynote from Senator Chris Murphy, and we will end, after two really engaging panels, we will end with a conversation with Guy Lawson, the author of the book Arms and the Dudes, which was made into the movie War Dogs, and will feature one of the dudes himself to talk about his experiences as an arms dealer for the Pentagon. So that is May 22nd. Please RSVP, come. There's a reception to follow. It's really an opportunity. If this was not enough arms trade for you, there is more opportunities ahead. And we also have an event on, just to Valerie's point, on May 23rd on global drones exports and international standards resulting from the new export policy. So stay tuned for lots of exciting events. Thank you all for coming, and for these marvelous speakers who I think really, from different sectors of our community, really amplified the trends and data regarding arms sales. So thank you to all of you.